This concludes our conversation about the contents inside our backups, but we still have one more topic here about restoring entire virtual machines. This is a special topic when you do need to restore virtual machines not to another on-premises location, but rather up into a cloud service. We can accomplish this with Microsoft Azure, with Amazon EC2. I'll actually show you the Azure example here, just like the other examples we've been working with so far. Let's start this process here by managing then our cloud credentials. Earlier, we were here and setting up a storage account here for our Veeam repo. And one of the first things you'll need to do is add in an Azure Compute account. This is what's necessary to then create the necessary resources there. I've already created this here by adding in my own Azure Compute account here into the wizard. And so you can see here for this Azure account, we're using the global region here, but we could connect here to Azure Stack, and we'll associate it here to the subscription and the account that we would use to log into the Azure portal. So here is my login here for gshields at company.prionline.microsoft.com. This is what's necessary for us to then make use of those Azure resources from here inside the Veeam console. Be aware that if you do not have a local installation on the machine where this console was running of Azure PowerShell, the wizard that we just saw will attempt to auto-install that Azure PowerShell in order to allow you to create those credentials. We didn't see that because I had the installation already. Now, before we actually get into recovering virtual machines into Azure, there is an optional additional function that we may want to add to speed up the process of that recovery. This is by configuring an Azure proxy. I'll show you down here under Backup Infrastructure that this is kind of a small auxiliary machine in Azure that Veeam will use to transport data to the blob storage up there in your Azure account. You can think of it essentially as a proxy server there in Azure, and it's actually configured here under Backup Proxies. So if I scroll up right here, let me right-click here and add now an Azure proxy. You may have noticed that this option was not available before entering in those Azure credentials. So for this, let's punch in, Veeam Azure proxy right here, and then keep the default setting here of 4 maximum concurrent tasks. If I hit next, this will take me to a page for entering in credentials for this small auxiliary machine that we're adding here in Azure. Now, normally I would add in the local administrator account here as administrator, but Azure does not actually allow you to use the administrator account as your local administrator. What we need to do then is to create another account to be used then as our representation of that local admin. I'll call mine local admin. I'll punch in the username and password here. This is what will be used to create then that local admin account on this machine that we're positioning up in Azure, this Azure proxy. Once I do that, I'll hit next down here. I can select then the subscription I want to use, whether it's a free trial or some other subscription here, as well as the location. So not necessarily Australia Central, but I'm in the West US, so I'll choose West US here. Let me choose next to identify then what VM size I want to use. For our purposes here, we can use a very small VM because we're not going to be doing a lot of activity there and transferring these resources up to Azure. If you happen to find that you'll be doing a lot more activity in restoring virtual machines to Azure, you may change the size here to a larger virtual machine. We'll still be using that same storage account that we configured back in that last course when we configured that Azure repo. If I choose next down here, I can select which resource group I want to use. I have an existing resource group already up there titled Veeam if I want to use that. And right down here, I can define the DNS name label to be used when I attempt to RDP to this machine I'm provisioning up there. If I choose next, this will take me then to the network. I have some existing network configurations that I can use. There's my 1.0 net that I configured and the subnet associated. I'll use those as well. That network needs to be accessible for this proxy to work from my on-premises location up there into wherever it's provisioning then my virtual machines. And so here on this final screen, you can see we're now deploying that Azure Proxy VM. It is worth mentioning that this Azure Proxy VM is not a required installation for us to restore these virtual machines. Rather, it's helpful for just speeding the process, just like having a local proxy server like what we currently have in our disaster recovery offsite environment. And so let me then pause things to allow this proxy to then deploy. Now, fast forwarding things about 10 or 12 minutes into the future, we can see now that this proxy VM has successfully been deployed there into Azure. Once we've done that, we now have what we need, even though the VM was indeed optional, but we now have what we need to support then the restore of a virtual machine up there into our Azure subscription. Let's then take a look at exactly how this works. I'll come back here to Home, and here under Backups, let's take a look then at one of the virtual machines. Let's attempt now to restore this virtual machine here, File 1, up there to Microsoft Azure. If I right-click here, I can restore here to Microsoft Azure, which brings up the wizard here for actually completing the restore. Let me choose my subscription right down here, and again, my location. I'll again choose West US. And because I've gone through the effort to deploy that Azure Proxy VM, let's use that Azure Proxy VM for increasing the speed of that restore. I'll choose Next down here, and I can identify then a VM size for how I actually want to configure this virtual machine. For this, let's choose Edit right here, and set this to the standard, for example, A2V2, which is a similarly sized virtual machine. I'll continue to use the same storage account here that we were using before, and if I choose Next down here, it's right here where I can define a different VM name and also which resource group I want to use. So setting that to something else with a prefix or a suffix on file 1, and then defining which resource group for which all these resources need to be installed into. I have a Veeam resource group already up there in Azure, so let's use that resource group to contain all these resources. I'll choose Next over here to again define what the network will be. If you recall, we have that same network we were working with before, that being our VNet 1.0 and our Subnet 1.0. And if I have a network security group I want to use, I can also use that as well. Here is my NSG-Veeam that I can configure here. If I want to use Secure Restore, I can again scan that virtual machine before sending it up to Azure, and then finally choose Next and Next to go about then restoring this virtual machine to the Azure cloud. At this point, there's really not much to see here, so I won't actually go through the restore here to Azure, but this is the process you would go through when you find yourself wanting to take virtual machines that are here on premises and make them available up there in Microsoft Azure.